All right, well, welcome everyone. My name's Devin Knight. We'll be kind of taking a little tour of Q&A today. I've actually done a Q&A webinar for us in the past, but this time I'm going to go cover a little bit of what we covered last time, if you watched that. But I'm also going to go a little bit more in depth. So we'll be looking specifically at two features called phrasing and synonyms, and we're going to kind of talk through how those are beneficial and what those do to really help you with creating more effective Q&A solutions. Again, my name is Devin Knight. You can see my email information here at dknight@pragmaticworks.com, as well as my Twitter handle there, which is @Knight_Devin. A little bit about myself. I'm the training director for Pragmatic Works, so any kind of training that we do usually goes through me at some level. I'm also a SQL Server MVP, and I've authored actually up to 6 books now, but I've authored several books. Most of them have to do with SQL Server. Actually, all of them have to do with SQL Server. I also run a local user group here in Jacksonville, Florida. That's where I'm from, and I run the SQL Server user group here down in Jacksonville. You'll also find that I blog quite a bit, usually, oftentimes about Power BI, and I blog at a website called bidn.com. All right, so here's our plan for today. I am going to review a little bit of what Power BI is. For those of you that it's new to, I don't think there's going to be too many people that it's completely new to, so we'll be pretty brief there. We're also going to cover things like what are Power BI sites. We'll look specifically at Power BI Q&A, and we'll also look at the features that are the focus of this webinar, which is synonyms and phrasing. But I do want to give you a little bit of context. I'm not going to jump straight into synonyms and phrasing without giving you that context, so we're going to build our way up to that. All right, so what is Power BI? Power BI really is several features wrapped in together as one functional tool for you. Now, to have the complete tool set, oftentimes, and this is why we ask the Office 365 question, but to have the complete tool set needed for Power BI, you'll need to be running Office 365. Now, a lot of the components that are available with Power BI and the Power BI tools can be done with regular Excel, regular on-premise Excel. So things like Power Pivot, Power Query, Power View, even Power Map in a preview mode can be done from regular Excel 2013, to be able to do those features. But when you decide that you want to take it a step further and really make a more collaborative environment, so the things I mentioned just to start off were the data extraction, data modeling, data visualization steps, can be done without having Office 365 or even Power BI licensing. But when you really want to take it a step further and make it where it's a more collaborative environment where you can take things like your Power Query queries and share them with others and enable features like Q&A and even do things like mobile BI, then you'll need to be using what's called a Power BI subscription. And I'm not going to go very deep into what a Power BI subscription is, but it kind of goes along with the Office 365 methodology, where it's more of a subscription-based model for purchasing this collaborative environment. It does require that you have several other subscriptions in place. So you would have to have, depending on if you're actually doing content development, you need to have an Office 365 subscription, as well as a Power BI subscription and a SharePoint Online subscription. So there's quite a few subscriptions that are involved with doing Power BI Q&A. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in depth. Just want you to be aware of that. If you want to do Q&A, you need to have a Power BI subscription. It's a subscription-based model for sharing and doing Q&A. All the other features, the features on the left-hand side here, the data extraction, data modeling, data visualization, does not require any subscription-based model. If you have regular Excel 2013, you can do that. All right, but we're focused in on this last step, this collaboration step, and specifically Q&A and Power BI sites. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Power BI sites are the location that gives you the ability to publish off your Power BI workbooks, or your Power Pivot workbooks, or your Excel workbooks that have Power BI content in them. You can take those Excel workbooks, publish them off to your Power BI site, and then you have the ability to, once they are located on that site, do things like schedule data refreshes, as well as do Power BI Q&A, which again is our focus for this webinar, is Q&A. So once you publish those workbooks out to your Power BI site, you simply enable the feature, and you can start asking your workbook questions. And you'll see we're going to go through some examples of that here in a few moments. The other piece of this is specifics of the Power BI site is that Q&A feature. Now, the Q&A feature uses something called the natural query language to return back results. Basically what that means is you're going to literally ask your workbook English written questions, like how much money did I make this year, and it's going to return back results. You don't have to have any kind of structured query language that you need to know to be able to return back results. No MDX, no T-SQL, no PL/SQL, no coding language at all. It's literally you're going to ask it English questions and it's going to return back results. And the pieces that are making this work behind the scenes are things like Power Pivot, as well as synonyms and phrasing, which we'll talk about for tuning your natural queries. But the big piece of it that's required is that Power Pivot model. Whenever you create a Power Pivot model in Excel, you'll deploy that to your Power BI site, and then it's a simple click to enable it for Power BI Q&A. But it does require a very strong model, and I'll talk about what I mean by strong model here in a moment. All right, so here's what I mean by strong model. This is what's really important when it comes to Power BI Q&A. Two things. The first one you need to do no matter what is a well-defined model. A well-defined model means a Power Pivot model. So if you're using Excel and you're using Power Pivot, which if a Power Pivot is new to you as well, then you can certainly look at some of our webinars about Power Pivot. But what's really important to get a good Q&A result is a well-defined model. And what that means is you need to have relationships defined. Okay, so if you have multiple tables that are inside your Power Pivot workbook, you certainly need to have relationships defined between those tables where it makes sense. You also need to have appropriate table and column names. So in some instances, you may be pulling in data from a source like SAP. Not sure how many of you have SAP data sources, but if you've ever looked at SAP before, they have really unusual table and column names. It's a German-based database, so there's very unusual table and column names in there. So it would be difficult for someone to ask questions that would actually happen to hit those tables or columns. So really making more appropriate table and column names for how a user would ask questions of your data is a big benefit or helps beneficially to creating a great Q&A solution. Other things here like choosing default fields. There's a property inside Power Pivot called default field set. If you turn on that default field set, basically what that does is you're setting a set of default fields for a table. So if you have a table, let's say your product table, and you tell it that you want your product name, your product price, the category, those things to be as the default fields, it'll return those fields by default whenever a query is initialized against that table. So if I'm using Q&A and I say show me products or show products, it'll return back all the fields that I set as default fields. Okay, and you'll see some examples of that as we go through some of our demos. Another important thing is data category. And by the way, I'm going to show you each of these things here in a few moments inside of a Power Pivot model. But a data category is really important as well to certain types of visualizations you may want to use. So say, for example, you have geographical data that you have inside of your Power Pivot model, and you want to make sure that that geographical data gets placed onto a map. Well, it's not going to do that automatically unless you set what's called a data category. When you set that data category, it tells Power BI Q&A that this is a state or that this is a city. And when it knows that this is a state or a city, it's not good enough that the column name says city or state. You actually need to place a data category on it. And when you place that data category on it, it knows how to properly visualize it. Last one here is aggregations. Now, you may already be aware, if you've done any Power Pivot at all, that the way Power Pivot works, and really the way Excel works, is if you give it a numeric data type, it's going to do what's called an implicit aggregation on it. An implicit aggregation is just any column that you have that is a number. Okay, so if you have a column that is a number, say for example your date table, you have a year column in there. Year may have a data type of a number or an integer. And if it has that data type, the way Excel works and the way Power Pivot works is it's going to assume that you want to aggregate year, which is probably not right. It's going to assume that you want to summarize year and roll all of the year values up into some kind of an aggregation. Well, that happens inside Q&A as well. If you don't set up your default aggregations, you'll see this appear, and I'm actually going to show you a demonstration of that here in a few moments. The other piece of this, which is also important, really secondary to having a good model. Having a good model or having a well-defined model has got to be the #1 thing you do, which is some of the things I listed here. Secondary to having a well-defined model is some new features that have been released over the last several months, which is called cloud modeling. And what cloud modeling allows you to do is to create these things called synonyms and phrasing that allow you to enhance what your Power Pivot model has specifically for Q&A. Now, synonyms, for example, can be done both in the cloud, which means on the Power BI site, or it can also be done in the workbook itself if you have Office 365, and we'll see this here in a few moments. Phrasing is also something that helps define relationships between your questions that you're asking, and I'll give you some more context to what I mean by that here in a few moments. But before we talk more about cloud modeling, let's look a little bit more at the top things we talked about here, the Power Pivot model. So here's what we're going to do is we're going to explore what are the important changes you need to make inside of Power Pivot. Okay, so things like that we just mentioned, like the relationships and column names and table names and default field sets. We'll look at that. We'll also look at how can you deploy that workbook to your Power BI site. And then we'll look at some of the basics of creating a Power BI Q&A solution on your model. Right after that, we're going to go more advanced. So I'm going to cover some of these basics, and then we'll go more advanced, and we'll look at things like synonyms and phrasing. Okay, so let's do this together here first. All right, so I have a workbook here already ready to go, and if you've done some webinars with me, I've used this workbook here a couple times for some different scenarios. This is United States presidential election data, okay? So it does have somewhat some interesting kind of results in here where you can actually look at the presidential elections for the United States over the last, really forever I have in here, but I'm filtered right now to the last 20 years or so. And what I'd like to do is be able to enhance this model for Q&A. So what I want to show you first is the kind of things that you would need to do. Okay, so a couple things I talked about earlier is first let's go to our Power Pivot model, of course. So I'm going to go over to my Power Pivot tab in Excel and manage this to take a look at our model. Now the things I mentioned that were really important were, first of all, was relationships. So if I show you here my diagram view, it's the best way or the easiest way to visualize your relationships. You can see I have a pretty basic model here, nothing too fancy about it. I have things like the year that the election was, the political party that ran, the candidate that ran, and I have the state that they won votes in, and then of course I have kind of my metric table here that has the actual results of the election. Now, again, a simple model, but the important thing here, of course, is to verify that your relationships that you have here are well-defined. And you can see here that they do have a relationship between them. They may have column names that are slightly different here, but that's not really going to impact it as far as Q&A goes. The impact here is just to ensure all of these have a relationship, and the way I can tell they have a relationship is by looking at the lines that you see here between each of the tables. Those lines represent the relationship, and if you double-click on a line like I just did a moment ago, it'll show you the relationship here in a dialog box where it's telling me that I'm relating the election results to the year table based on the year column. So it's giving me that information here, and it's good that we're able to tell that inside of our model. So check relationships, that's our first thing. Yes, we look like we have strong relationships here. The other thing that you should check and validate is both table and column names. So first, looking at table names here, it looks like they're pretty straightforward names. If you're pulling, for example, off of a data warehouse, which of course you do not have to do for a Power Pivot model, but if you are pulling from a data warehouse, you would typically want to pull off any prefixes you might have on your tables. For example, if you have a dim or a fact prefix to your table names for a dimension table or a fact table, you want to remove those prefixes off, of course. You want to add in spaces where it's appropriate. So you can see here political space party, election space results. Spaces are okay here, and they're actually pretty important when it comes to Q&A. So you want to make sure you have all those things added in as well. So looking at this, it looks like year, state, election results, political party, candidate, those are appropriate table names. You can certainly dive in even deeper, go look at your column names here, validate that they will return back the kind of results you would anticipate having if someone were to ask a question of this data. It looks like they're just fine here. Okay. The next thing I want to point out to you is the default field set. Now the default field set is important, and the way the default field set works is it's actually under the Advanced tab of your Power Pivot model. Okay, so under your Advanced tab of your Power Pivot model, when you select a table, you'll see there's this option here called Default Field Set. And basically what the default field set is doing for you is, you may have seen this in Power View before, but it's going to bring a set of default fields across whenever you select this table. So if I were to select information from this table, or let's say, for example, in Power View, this is how it works. If I double-click on a table name, it'll just bring across these fields. If I provide the fields here that I want to be the default fields for this table, it'll bring these certain fields across for me. So otherwise, it's just going to bring all of them across that are visible. So you can see here I have several fields that are visible. If I don't specify a set of default fields, it's going to bring across all of the ones that are visible. So you'll want to make sure that you set these up, set up a default field set for each of the tables. So political party, for example, I only have one appropriate column. But I could do a default field set on it anyways and tell it that I want to bring across the party name as my default field or fields that I use for this table. And again, the whole point of this is so that whenever someone selects this table or writes a question that returns back information from that table, it brings across a set of default fields for them. Okay. All right, so that's default field set. The two more things I want to show you here is the data category first. Now the data category is also found on the Advanced tab. The data category here is basically you identifying a category for a column. So I've selected here my state column. And on my state column, you'll see up in the Advanced tab, I have a data category which is actually suggested by Power Pivot. So Power Pivot looked at the information I had in that table as well as the column name and identified this as both a state or a province for the suggested data category. And in this case, it's actually correct. It correctly interpreted that. And the benefit, of course, of me doing this is whenever I create a question in Q&A that refers to this particular column, it realizes that this data category falls under the geography type. So it's a geography type, and you can see several other geography types here. And then when it sees that it has that geography type, it's going to automatically place it in a map for me. So we're basically giving a little assist to Q&A to help it understand how to visualize a state. We're telling it that a state is actually a geographical type, and it should be mapped to this property here. And when we map it to that property, it understands that it should map it. Okay? All right, the last one here that we're going to talk about is default aggregations, which really has to do with this summarize by property that's also on the Advanced tab. Now, the way I want to show this one to you and really identify the problem here is I'm actually going to go ahead and start our full demonstration here rather than giving you any more tour of Power Pivot. The way I'm going to start our demonstration here is I'm going to go ahead and take this model that we're looking at here, and I'm going to publish this off to my SharePoint site. So I'm going to go to my File menu here. You could certainly start from the SharePoint site if you wanted to, but I'm going to go to my File menu, and I'll tell it I want to save this as. Okay, and you'll see I have my SharePoint sites already listed out here, but if this is your first time deploying to SharePoint, you can actually just tell it you want to browse to a computer. Okay, because the reason I see SharePoint already listed here previously is because I have deployed to SharePoint at least once. If you haven't deployed to SharePoint before, then you can certainly just come to your computer here and hit Browse, and then you can provide the URL that you want to deploy to. So for my situation here, rather than deploying locally somewhere, I'm actually going to deploy and I'm going to provide the URL to my SharePoint site I have saved over here. And then I can tell it that I want to save this in my documents. And here's a list of all the workbooks that I have already deployed to my Power BI site. So I'll go ahead and save this new election data workbook here. All right, so I've now saved that to SharePoint. You can see in the bottom that it's actually working on deploying that to SharePoint. It's already done. And now I can go open up my Power BI site and I'll refresh it. Okay. By the way, you can sign up for a free trial of Power BI as well. If you haven't done it already, or if you're new to Power BI, you want to explore what it can do, you can certainly sign up for a Power BI trial. I believe the URL is just powerbi.com. Now, you'll notice here I have several workbooks that are already deployed out here. Some for other demonstrations that we've done here at Pragmatic Works. But you'll notice here this election data was just uploaded a moment ago or a minute ago by myself. And you'll notice this is the only one that doesn't have a little thumbnail to it, or you can't see a little preview of it. The reason that is we just need to enable it for Power BI. So we need to enable it on this site. To enable this workbook, you're simply going to hit the little ellipses next to the workbook and tell it you want to enable it. Now basically this just makes it so that it's available for doing things like data refreshes. It's able to dive into the structure of the workbook and do things like even Q&A, which is our next step. Our next step is going to be to enable Q&A for this workbook. So first you have to enable it for Power BI. You could open it here or just hit close. I don't necessarily need to look at it here. I'm going to hit close. Once you enable it for Power BI, you'll see that little thumbnail does appear and it's ready to go. Now you can actually launch this now if you want to, and it'll give you a view of this report. It'll stay interactive. It'll all be just like it was in Excel basically, but from an Excel services view of it from SharePoint Online. But really what I want to demonstrate here is more the Q&A features. And to do Q&A, there's one more step you have to do here, which again is pretty easy. You'll hit the little ellipses and tell it that you want to enable for Q&A. Let's try that one more time. There it is, add to Q&A. So you'll select this option here called add to Q&A. And if you select that option here called add to Q&A, it makes it where this is available for Q&A. So what that tells you is you can have some workbooks deployed out to your Power BI site that are used for Q&A and others that are not. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it I want to add this one to Q&A. It just takes a second. It tells me that's now been added to Q&A. And I can scroll up to the top part of the site, and I'll see that there's this option here in the top right that says Ask with Power BI Q&A. So that's where you kind of get started, or where you can get started to start using Q&A and asking questions of your data. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I'll hit this Ask with Power BI Q&A link here. It's going to take me to a page that has several featured questions. These are called featured questions. They're basically questions that you've predefined and you've created these little tiles for, so it's easier for you to go back to them later. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But when you want to just start asking questions of your data, you'll come up to the little search bar up at the very top, and you'll start asking questions. So for example, if I wanted to return back some information from my election data, I could say something like show parties, with an S on the end there. There we go. I can ask it to show parties, and it's going to give me a list of all the political parties that I have inside my workbook. Very quickly, it's able to bring back a list of values here just by asking it to show the parties. I can also do things like this. I can ask it to show the number of candidates. And what it interprets that as is when I say show the number of, it's kind of indicating that I want a count of something. So it's able to look at that Q&A using the natural query language here, interprets this show number of as, hey, I want to see a count of the number of candidates I have, and that's what it's done for me here. It's shown me a count of candidates that I have. So some kind of interesting things you can do here. Now the other piece of this as well that you'll find interesting is that you can go more in depth, and you'll really see where your model might have deficiencies. So I'm going to find here pretty quickly where I need to fix my Power Pivot model to make it more usable for Power BI Q&A. So for example, if I asked it something like to show me the votes by year here, it will show me the votes by year, but you'll notice this problem that I'm having. This problem that I'm having is that it's used year as an implicit measure where it's automatically aggregating year and rolling up all the years that I have and summing it. It's kind of doing a group by or really rolling up all the years, I should say. It's summarizing year, it's summarizing the total votes into a one-row value here, which is not what I want at all. So the problem that I'm having here is more of a problem with my Power Pivot model. It's not a problem with Q&A, it's a problem with my Power Pivot model. And the problem is basically that I haven't told it that year should not be aggregated. And when it sees that year has a data type of a number, it assumes to go ahead and aggregate it. So the problem is that it's an easy fix. It's a basic fix, and the way that we fix this is back inside of our Power Pivot model. So back inside my Power Pivot model, I'll go over to Manage, and I'll select the year column in my year table, and under the Advanced tab, I'll tell it how do I want to aggregate this, because it sees, first of all, let me show you this. First of all, it sees that the year column has a whole number data type, okay, so it is a number value, and the way Excel works and the way Power Pivot works is when it sees that you have a number value, it assumes you want to aggregate it. So what I'd like to do is when you see that whole number Excel, what I'd like you to do is instead of aggregating it, I want you to, under the Advanced tab, I'm going to change the Summarize By to Do Not Summarize. So when you see this column year, because I have it selected, I've told it not to summarize it, just to display the values. Okay? Easy enough. That's all I have to do. Now I can republish this off. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this here for a moment. Now one thing I've seen with Power BI that gives me a little bit of an issue is that you might find that it is sometimes difficult to deploy model changes on top of it. So what I've had to do, at least in the meantime, is delete the model and redeploy, because I found whenever I deploy on top of it, it doesn't pick up some changes, some important changes that I've deployed. So it's an easy fix, though. I'm going to go ahead and just delete the model we deployed a moment ago and go ahead and save this one back out. Okay, so just basically the steps that we did just a moment ago. This time I'm going to use my little shortcut for saving, and I'll save this workbook back out. Now with this save back out, I'll need to enable that for Power BI and enable it for Q&A again. And again, the reason I had to kind of do this a second time is because I found that for some reason Power BI, if you redeploy on top of the previous model, it doesn't pick up some of the model changes like I just made a moment ago. And if I ask that same question again, it wouldn't pick up the change. So I've redeployed. I'm going to enable this again, same step I did a moment ago. And once it enables itself, we'll go ahead and turn on Q&A. Just like we did a moment ago, once we've deployed, you enable Power BI, and then you hit the same button to enable Q&A again. Okay, so I'll give that here a moment. There it goes. And then now I can add it to Q&A. Now, I've made that small change. Remember, this is the small change I made, was I found the column here that was giving me an issue, which was the year column. And I told it under the Advanced tab inside Power Pivot that I do not want to summarize that value. And now when I ask that same question again, so if I come back up here to ask with Power BI Q&A, and I'll tell it again that I'd like to see the votes by year, it's going to return back the values, and this time it's interpreted as I should show a distinct list of these values. It's no longer aggregating year. It's now instead, it's actually going to show me each distinct value for year here, kind of like I would anticipate it. Now, one thing you might not like about this is that it's bringing back year as a kind of a bar chart here, when really you would think of this as being more of a trend value. So this is kind of a neat thing you can do with Q&As. You can actually go up to the search bar here, and you can tell it that you'd like to see the votes by year as a line, or as a line chart. You can type it all the way out. And just by the way that you ask the question, to say votes by year as a line, it interpreted that as, hey, you want to see this as a line chart. So it's done that for me. It's showing me these values as a line chart here now. Now, the visualizations that you're seeing here are actually using Power View to be able to visualize your report for you. So all these visualizations that you see automatically being created are all through Power View. And because they're through Power View, you can actually come over here on the right-hand side, and on the right-hand side where it says explore this result, you can change the visualization. So if you prefer to see this as a table or as a map, obviously this one doesn't make sense for a map, but you can change any of the visualizations to visualizations that you have inside of Power View. So if I prefer to see this as a table, I can select table, and it'll give me a list of the values in a table form. You can also go to filters, and it gives you the typical kind of Power View filters that you can go through and filter down your data. Finally, the fields list, you can add in or remove fields that you do or don't want to include. These are all of the tables and columns that you've made visible, keyword there, these are the visible columns inside of your Power Pivot model. So you can go in and actually add to what Power BI Q&A did for you by checking off additional columns here. So if I wanted to see the candidates, I can check off candidate, and it now returns back each of the candidates inside that visualization as well. Okay. All right, so that's this little section here, this explore this field section. You'll also notice right above that you have this results from. This results from section, what this is returning back for you is which workbook is it returning back the results. Now you'll notice I never told it to return back from election results. The reason that worked without me having to tell it to pull data back from election results is because Power BI Q&A looked at the question I asked, and based on the question I asked, it interpreted and figured out which workbook to pull back from. So if I were to ask something like GDP, wow, I'm really struggling here, GDP of United States, okay? You'll notice here that when I asked for the GDP of the United States, it's changed the workbook, and just based off the question I asked, it's now pulling back from the World Bank Indicator sample workbook that I have. If I asked about gold medals, it would pull back from the Olympics data. And of course, when I asked about the election data, so show political parties, or just parties even, okay, it's now going to pull back, and I misspelled parties, it's now going to pull back from the election results or the election data workbook. Now you can certainly change this if it makes a mistake and doesn't pull back from the right workbook, which certainly could happen if you have column names that are similar to each other. You can hit the little down arrow here and select which workbook you would like to ask this natural query of. So you do have the ability there to change which workbook you're referring to very easily. Okay. All right. Now, let me also show you another example here. So let's say I want to see the votes by states. Okay. Now remember we looked at state earlier. Votes by state. State that column had a data category. And just as a reminder, the reason why we're seeing a map visualization here is because there was a data category set up on that state column. Because if I were to say votes by candidate, or let's say party, votes by party, it realizes that the data category for that is not a geography field, so it doesn't visualize it as a map. But when I say votes by state, it realizes that that data category is a state property, or a data category of state is a state or province, and so it actually visualizes it with an appropriate map here. This was, just as a reminder, this was inside of our model. If we were to go look at our state table, if we selected the state column, it had a data category under the Advanced tab of state or province. And that's what gave it the ability to visualize it as a map here automatically for me. I didn't have to tell it a map. Of course, I could change it to a map if it didn't do it by default. Remember, I showed you that a moment ago. You can come on the right-hand side and tell it how you want to visualize that data. All right. Good deal. So last one I want to show you here before we go to some more advanced stuff. A couple more ones here. Just to get some level setting, if this is the first time you've seen Q&A, you could, of course, say not only votes by state, but I can say votes by state by Democratic and Republican Party. Party's Republican. And it realizes when I say by Democratic and Republican that I want to visualize it in two separate maps. You can see I have a Democratic Party map and a Republican Party map here. You could also say, well, I want to see this with a specific filter on it. So I can tell it I want to see this data in 2008, and it's smart enough to interpret in 2008 as a filter, and it's actually interpreting that and showing me here where it's automatically only filtering to show the data in 2008. So it's interpreted my in 2008 as setting a filter on this, and you'll actually see the results are filtered to 1 year as well. So it's really smart. It's able to take natural queries or natural ways you ask of your data and interpret that as a real query against the data sets, real DAX query in the back end. All right, so the last one I'll show you here that's basic, and then we'll go more advanced. You can also do some ranges. You could say show parties. Okay, give it a second here to wake up. Sometimes when you type these things out, it needs an extra second. Show parties with greater than 5 candidates, and that way I kind of filter out some of the fringe parties here, and it just brings me back some of the parties that have more candidates. So I can see if it has more than 5 candidates, this is probably a political party that's actually had some relevance to it over the years. And you can see again that it takes that filter and places it inside of the filter section here. You can also do range filters, by the way, so I could say political parties that are greater than 5 candidates and less than 10 candidates. You can do things like that as well. All right. Let's go a bit more advanced, though. So here's what I want to do with you guys now. And I'm going to go back to my slides for just like 1 or 2 slides here. I think it's 2. Actually, it's only 1 slide. To talk about cloud modeling. Okay, so we've gotten some of the basics of how Q&A works. I went all the way from starting from nothing, deploying it off to Power BI and doing some Q&A questions on my solution. But let's go a little bit more advanced and talk about what cloud modeling is. Cloud modeling gives you the ability to, from your Power BI site, enhance your solution. So I can add in things like synonyms, okay? And basically what synonyms are aliases for your column and table names. Okay, so think of, I gave an example earlier of SAP. If you had an SAP data source, the column and table names in SAP are oftentimes very unusual and difficult to happen to have the users ask a question that would actually return back results from it. So what synonyms are is you can actually go in and manually add synonyms or aliases for your table and column names. So that way you can ensure that your users actually get back the results when they ask a question. They can get back the results they would anticipate. So for my example here is I have a column inside my model called total popular vote. Okay, I'll show you right here. Inside my table I have a column called, right here, it's actually a measure. I have a total popular vote measure down here at the bottom. But my users are very unlikely to type out the full thing, total popular vote. They're much more likely to type in something called like votes. If they might ask, what are the votes for a party or votes for a candidate, I want to make sure they still get results. Even though they don't ask for total popular vote, I want to make sure they get results just when they ask for votes. Now this can be done by creating something called synonyms. You can see synonyms exist inside of the Excel Power Pivot window. If you're using Office 365, you'll see this little button up here in the top. And you can create these synonyms in the model itself, in the Excel workbook, or you can actually do it from the Power BI site. You have 2 different ways you can create synonyms, either from the Excel workbook inside of Excel or from the Power BI site using the cloud modeling technique I'm about to show you. Either way are fine. Either way work. What happens when you save it inside the cloud modeling technique, it actually saves it back to the workbook as well. But it saves it, keep in mind, it does save it back to the workbook that's in the cloud. So if you wanted to pick up those changes, you'd have to download the workbook from your Power BI site. So again, two different ways of doing synonyms. One from your Excel interface, if you have Office 365, and then the other way is from Power BI site, which is the way I'm going to show you here in a few moments. The other thing I want to show you as well is something called phrasing. Okay, and what phrasing is really how we talk about the relationship between things. So the goal with creating phrasing is to reduce ambiguity, and wow, I'm really struggling here today. Ambiguity, that's what I meant to say, between the columns that you have and between the ways that you ask questions of your data. So for example, if I were to ask in my election data results, who won in 2008? Well, the phrase, or really the verb, won, is difficult to understand for Q&A. I don't have any column called won, or really I shouldn't have a column called won. It's really a word that defines the relationship between the person, the who, and the what, which is in 2008, or maybe a more specific question like who won the election in 2008. That's probably the real question I would ask. So what phrasing does is it defines and helps you understand the relationship between words. Phrasing can be a verb, phrasing can be a noun, you'll see phrasing can even be a preposition. There's a lot of ways that you look at it, and you almost have to go back to your grade school English class to remember what a preposition is, remember obviously what a noun is, what a verb is, what an adjective is. All those things are important when it comes to phrasing, and we'll take a look at a couple examples of that as well. All right, so let's go to our Power BI site again, and I'm going to show you how to do some cloud modeling and how to do that cloud modeling for both synonyms and phrasing. All right, so I'm going to work my way back over to our Power BI site. Okay. Now, like I mentioned earlier, you can do synonyms from your Excel workbook, but you can also do them from the Power BI site. One thing I forgot to mention, you can, of course, create featured questions. So if you want to create a featured questions, here you can do it like this. You'll hit the little add, the plus sign here next to the featured questions. This is one way you can do it. There's a couple ways you can do this. And I can tell it, show me votes by party. Okay, and this is the question I'm going to ask. You can tell it, do you want to add it to your home page? Do you want a small or a large tile view over here? What kind of background do you want to have? What kind of symbol or icon do you want to have here? You can choose whatever you want. Or you can also do a background image. I happen to have a background image here in the background of one of our former presidents that I can place as the background for my image, and when I click away, you'll see when I hit save actually there, it'll actually take this votes by party question, put a image to it, and when I hit save, it's going to add that here as a featured question, and you'll see that featured question here pop up after a few seconds. There it comes on the bottom here. So votes by party is returned back. And this basically is just a shortcut for a commonly asked question. So I can click on that votes by party and it'll bring me back the results from that. All right, so I just want to show you featured questions really quickly there. Now, to do cloud modeling can be done from the site settings of your Power BI site. Now, I know a lot of people have given a lot of feedback to Microsoft about the navigation of Power BI. The navigation of how to move around in this Power BI site is not the greatest, and here's what I mean by that. Right now, if I want to go to the Power BI site settings, I would normally come over to this little configuration icon here in the top right up here. I'd click on that and I would select Site Settings, Power BI Site Settings. Unfortunately, from where I'm at right now, you do not see that as an option. So what I have to do is go back to my Power BI site. Okay, so I'm working my way back to my Power BI sandbox site that I have here. And this is actually my Power BI. You can have your own favorite workbooks here and your favorite reports. But I want to go back to the main Power BI site. And in this main Power BI site, when I go back to the main site, this is actually where I originally started at and deployed to. When I go back to this original Power BI site, I can now see underneath the configuration icon in the top right that I do have the option here to go to the Power BI site settings. So again, the navigation is a little kludgy. I don't really care for some portions of it. But it's getting there. They've actually made some improvements on it, and I think you'll see more improvements come, I'm sure. So I'm going to go launch the Power BI site settings. And what this is going to take me to and give me the ability to do under the Q&A tab here is it's going to give me the ability to actually add and enhance how searches are done against my workbooks. So it shows you all the published workbooks that I have here. And the one that I want to modify here is the election data one. That's the one that we deployed out together. And I'm going to hit the little ellipses and tell it that I want to optimize for Q&A. You can, of course, open it in Excel. You can remove it from Q&A here as well. But I want to optimize it for Q&A. Now, some of the functionality that you'll see here, you probably wouldn't typically think of the typical end user doing. Now, the Q&A feature that you showed where you just ask questions, that one you can see it's almost the lowest common denominator of your users. You know, a user, any user that you have that knows how to use a search engine can probably ask the question, votes by state, and be comfortable with it, or votes by states and be comfortable with getting the results back. That's something that anyone that can do a search engine can do. They can ask votes by state or votes by states here and hopefully should be able to get the results they would anticipate. They should know how to use a search engine and should be and thus be able to figure out how to use Q&A as far as the typical functionality. But what you might have, what they might have the difficulty doing, and I need to hit enable content. Here's why I didn't actually visualize that. What they may need some help doing, or really you might have to do yourself as an IT professional, if that's your role, is adding in this cloud modeling steps. And the cloud modeling steps, of course, being synonyms and phrasing. This is something I wouldn't typically anticipate a end user doing. This is more of maybe a power user, probably an IT professional of some kind, maybe a consultant like myself coming on site to help you quickly add and enhance to your Q&A functionality that you have. So what I'd like to do is first start by creating some synonyms. Okay, so synonyms here are done. You'll see over here in this little pane on the right-hand side, I'm getting initially some information about what's been done already for me. You'll see here that Power BI Q&A actually has automatically auto-generated some synonyms and some phrasing for me. So that's great. It's automatically done some work for me. You'll also see there's some customized synonyms done. And so at some point I've saved some synonyms in here, even though I've deployed a fresh workbook in here, it's saved those synonyms in here, and it's holding on to those. So you'll actually see some of those synonyms here in a few moments. But just note that Power BI Q&A will automatically generate synonyms and automatically generate phrasing for you as well. You'll just likely need to enhance it in some cases because the phrasing and the synonyms that it'll create may not actually solve all your problems for you. It likely will not all solve all your problems for you, so you'll have to come to your own. All right, so for me, I'm going to come create some synonyms here. So I'll come into the Synonyms tab. I'll see underneath the Synonyms tab that I can do things like add in synonyms on each of my tables as well as my columns inside those tables. So say, for example, I want to ask the question, maybe my users won't ask for candidates, but maybe they'll ask for people. So if I ask the question, show people, well, show people is trying to return back a political party called the People's Political Party, but really I wanted to return back the candidates. So what I could do is I could add in a synonym and say, all right, well, if you're really looking for candidates and you ask for people, I can add in a synonym here, and it's just a comma-separated list where I can add in people as a synonym. And when I add in people as a synonym, it also then returns back and helps my question return back all of the candidates. So I've now added an alias for a candidate. If someone is looking for a candidate, they can also type in people. I could also make it so they can type in person. So they can type in people or person and make those as possible synonyms here for my users. Let's also do this for, let's say, the political party. So I'm going to go down to the political party table here. These are all the tables that I have. And right now you'll see here there's a party name. And party name already has a synonym in it here for the name. Someone might just type in name and expect to return back results. But I'm going to type in something like affiliates. So or affiliation maybe. So if they affiliate themselves with a political party, then I want to make sure that I pick that up. So I'm going to type in something like affiliations and try and type it right. There's a reason why I'm in IT. Affiliations or affiliates or affiliations, whatever you might do, I might type in both in here to make sure that I pick up those synonyms for what a party name is. So I could type in something now like what would normally be show political party or show party, I can now instead type in something different. Instead of typing in political party, let's say I want to show affiliations or show affiliates. Okay, and basically that's interpreted that show affiliates as political parties. So it's showing me different affiliations that my parties might have. I also want to be able to see and interpret something like my election results. So right now I have an election results table. The previous two examples, we looked at seeing synonyms for column names, but you can also do synonyms for tables. So I can add a synonym here for the table name called election results, and I can add in a one here called election or elections. I'll just put in election. And that means I can then try and interpret when someone wins an election. Right now there's nothing in here, but I can see votes and electoral votes and things like that, but I don't see anything that just identifies an election. So I'm going to add in an alias or a synonym for the election results table, and I'm going to call it elections. You can also see there's several other synonyms that have been created in here. Anything that has a comma before it or a comma after it is a synonym that's been added in either by myself or automatically by Power BI Q&A. Now once you create the synonyms and you're happy with them, you can hit the Save button here in the bottom left, and that will save these synonyms back out to the workbook for you. Okay? I'm not going to quite save it yet. I want to do a little bit more work in here. We've added some synonyms. We've seen how synonyms work. I can ask the question differently here now to return back results. Let's now show one other way of doing things. And this last way is going to be using phrasing. Okay, so this is the latest feature as far as how Q&A works. And what phrasing allows you to do, like we mentioned earlier, this allows you to be able to interpret kind of a way that we talk, a way that people talk, and be able to still return back your results. So for example, if I were to ask the question here, which people ran for election in 2008, you'll see I'm not going to really get the results back that I would anticipate. Okay, so here I'm getting back results from the year table, and the reason why, first of all, I misspelled election, but the reason why I'm not getting back the results I would have anticipated is because Power BI Q&A doesn't understand what this verb mean. What does ran mean? What does it mean for someone to run for an election? Well, we understand that because we are comfortable with that phraseology, but Power BI doesn't. It doesn't speak English quite like we do, so we have to kind of help it out a little bit, and we have to tell it what does it mean when someone runs for an election. So what we can do here to help Power BI Q&A and understand what that verb means is we can create some phrasing. All right, so here's how we can do this. I'm going to go over to the phrasing tab here inside the editor and in my cloud modeling editor here, and I'm going to add in a new phrase. So I'll add in a phrasing here, and I'm going to tell it what does it mean for someone to run for an election. I'm going to have to tell it here that candidates, I'm going to zoom in on this for you, candidates run for elections. Okay? And you'll notice here that it's actually interpreted that phrase I typed in where I'm associating a candidate with an election. It sees that a candidate is one of my entities, one of my columns that I have. It sees that run is a verb. It sees that for is a preposition. Those things are kind of smushed in there together, but verb, preposition. And then an election or an elections is another type of entity that I have. And this is supposed to reduce the ambiguity that I have between the candidate and an election. I understand now that one runs for an election. Now there's some advanced functionality we can do here as well, but I want to show you in a basic one here first. So I'm going to go ahead and add this one in. I'll hit OK. I've now added in this custom phrasing here called candidates run, or candidate runs for election. And you'll now see that my results actually return back. That same query that we had in my screen earlier, which people ran for election in 2008, is now actually returning back results, and it's returning back results accurately. These are all the people, even people beyond what you would typically think of, that ran for election in 2008. You can see here Barack Obama, who won the election. You see John McCain in here. All the people that ran for election are listed here. So I can go a little bit more advanced here if I want to with my search. We've already fixed it. Power BI now understands what it means for someone to run for an election. I even combined some phrasing with a synonym I had. People was a synonym for candidate earlier, so I'm combining some things together here. So I can go a little bit more advanced. I can say, all right, well, let's say which candidates won elections. So let's just say which candidates ran for elections. And now that'll go beyond my filter of 2008, and you can see the results are much wider here. And so it's just showing me all the people that have ever run for an election. I don't have to filter it to a particular year. All right, let's do one more. Let's say this next one. Let's say which person won the election in 2008. So I could say which candidate, but I'm trying to use one of my synonyms here. Again, Q&A doesn't understand what it means for someone to win or won an election. So what we have to do is we have to define in the phrasing section that I just showed you a moment ago, what does it mean for someone to win an election? Now this one's going to be a little bit more advanced. Let me show you what I mean on this one. How are we going to define what it means for someone to win an election? So we're going to go add another phrasing here. So I'll add in a phrase, okay? And this time my phrase is going to be defining what does it mean for a candidate to win an election. So our definition here is going to be candidates win elections. Okay, so that's our phrasing that we want to define here. Now you can hit OK on this. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK on this for now. Okay. Now you'll notice here my results aren't returning back how I would anticipate them. And the reason is because we didn't clearly define what it means to win an election. So the way we can enhance this is we can select the phrase that we created. We can select the phrasing and go a little bit deeper. Okay, so right now it's just saying candidates win elections. Well, that's kind of confusing. So we can enhance this a little bit more. We can say candidates win elections, and we can add on a custom advanced setting here. You'll see there's the show advanced setting option. If I click on that, it tells me here that right now the subject matter is the candidate, the verb is that they win, and then I can go even more in depth here and I can kind of create other indirect objects that are used as far as this phrase goes. I can identify prepositions that are in here. Remember I said that in my last one that candidates run for elections. For would have been a preposition in here. And I can even go into the point where I can add in a condition. So this is where you can really identify what does it mean to win an election. So if I wanted to here, I can tell it that, well, to win an election, you have to have at least 270 electoral votes, right? That's to win a United States presidential election. They use the Electoral College, and for them to win an election, that means that they have to have the total, not the popular vote, but the total electoral votes won, right here, has to be greater than or equal to. Let me zoom in on this for you. The total electoral votes won has to be greater than or equal to 270. If you get 270 electoral votes, you win the election. That's how things work in America. We're odd like that. It doesn't matter how many people actually vote for you. It matters about the Electoral College. All right, just kidding. All right, so I've set and I've defined that phrase now. So if I click away from it, you'll notice here that the phrase, not only does the phrase work because I can see that the person that won the election in 2008 was Barack Obama, and that's the result I got back, but you can also see the actual phrase here. It says the candidate wins election results where the total electoral votes are greater than or equal to 270. So what I can do now is I can see, all right, well, this worked for 2008. Let's see if it worked for 2004. Who won in 2004? Yeah, George W. Bush won in 2004. All right, what if I want to see who won all the elections? So I can take off the year here and say which person won the election. This shows me all of the candidates of all time that won elections. So phrasing worked here. Phrasing is saying, all right, look at the electoral votes. Show me who had more than that number of electoral votes, greater than or equal to, and return back those results. Now, here's the last piece that I want to show you here. Is you can certainly come into Q&A and you can add in some sorting capability as well. So I can tell it that I want to see who won the elections, but I want to sort by year. Okay, so it's sorting by year, and it's bringing back and showing me all of the election results over the last, really forever, except for I'm missing 2012 here. But it's showing me all the election results won, and it's actually visualizing the total popular vote here, but we know that my phrasing is allowing me to return it based off of my electoral votes. I misspelled sort by. Let me fix that real quick. And you can also, when you do your sort by, you can tell it you want to do it descending, and that'll give you the correct information there as well for you. So really neat stuff that you can do here with Q&A. Q&A gives you the ability to not only ask questions of your data, like we showed here, but it also gives you the ability to take that extra step further and be able to interrogate and enhance the way that you ask questions. So here we showed how you can use synonyms and phrasing to be able to use that to enhance the way you ask your questions. One thing I want to show you here as well is the last step that I would do here is I would go ahead and save this. I would hit save, and when you hit save, it's going to go ahead and save that back to your workbook. You can also export this. So say, for example, you have a dev Power BI site and a production Power BI site. I can export my Q&A, my features that I've added here for phrasing and synonyms, and it exports it into like an XML document here. And you can take this linguistics schema and import that into another Power BI site that you have. So if you did all this in dev and you want to push it over to production, you can easily do that here by doing a little export and import of the linguistic settings that you just created, all that phrasing. Now, Microsoft has put out on their blogs quite a few blogs on how to do Q&A and how to use synonyms in Q&A to enhance your model. This is one such blog that you can find just by searching out on how to use and how to do phrasing. This is actually a link that I found from digging through their help documents. And what this walks you through is how you can create phrasing both on nouns, on verbs, on adjectives, on prepositions, and it gives you several examples where you're trying to list customers with orders, or where you're trying to apply things like adjectives, which products are discounted. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can be able to go in depth. Back ordered. What does back ordered mean? So you can define what these things mean. So really, really neat things that you can do in here to be able to make it clear on what kind of results it should return back for your users. Now, all this stuff is fairly new. Power BI in itself is still pretty new as far as technologies go. So you're starting to see more and more adoption of this, but I think as you start to play with this, of course, go sign up for the trial if you haven't already. Start to play with it, see what you think about it, and Microsoft is eager to get your feedback about how to make it better. So you can push your own workbooks out there and start to enhance it and get some Q&A solutions built on top of it. So with the last, I have 5 minutes left here. With the last 5 minutes, I'll leave my slide up here I have, but I'll take some questions. Liz, if you have some queued up. If you think of some later, by the way, you can always email me here at dni@pragmaticworkers.com. You can see my Twitter and my blog here as well. But go ahead, Liz.
Okay. I'm not sure which feature they're asking us about. It was about 20 minutes into your presentation. They want to know if this feature requires HTML5 and Office 365.
Okay. So what we're seeing here is the components of Power Pivot that do synonyms do require Office 365, so it's a bit confusing. There's portions of it that require Office 365. If you plan on publishing workbooks out there that have synonyms in there, you do need Office 365. There's really three things. Let me whiteboard this here for a moment because it is confusing. So to do the whole suite of everything I showed, you need 3 separate subscriptions. So 3 subscriptions. Those being, I'll try and make it less confusing, even though I know it is confusing. You need a subscription for Office 365. Okay. You also need a SharePoint Online subscription, and you also need a Power BI subscription. Okay. These are each individual subscriptions per user. Okay. Now, you might not have every user publishing things, so this is per user. You might not have every user actually publishing workbooks. You might have a lot of users that are just interacting with workbooks. Now, if they're developing and they're actually publishing and doing everything, if you need them to do everything, this would be your developer here. Okay. Now, if they're just consumers of it, they don't necessarily need to have Excel, Office 365. They just want to go to a web page and ask questions. Then they would need these two. So just user licensing here. Say per data consumer. Okay? So a little bit different depending on what you want to do. If you want to develop, publish, and do things like data refreshes and Q&A, you'll need these 3 licenses: Office 365, SharePoint Online, Power BI subscriptions. If you're just looking into doing Q&A as far as the data consumer, they would need to be licensed for SharePoint Online and Power BI. Now, if you're new to the whole subscription-based model, for the most part, with some exceptions, depending on how frequently you renew your Office licensing, your SA agreements that you have, your software assurance that you have, you're probably looking at about the same price. If you go to more of the subscription-based model, for a lot of our customers, it's ending up being about the same price as it would be for them to renew those agreements regularly. Again, it just depends on how frequently you renew your service agreements with Microsoft for licensing. But for the most part, the licensing that you'll pay here with this is about the same that you would for regular on-premise Office and SharePoint. Not a whole lot different. In some cases, it's even been cheaper for some of our customers. It just depends on how frequently you renew those licensing. Definitely check it out. If you go to PowerBI.com, they even have the pricing on there for you, and you can take a look at that. I'll bring that up here while Liz is prompting the next question here.
Okay. Does the native search language only support English? How about non-English search if the data has its own language?
Great question. So as of right now, it is only supporting English, but I've heard that it's coming for other languages soon. As of right now, it's just English for now.
Okay. Does
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Does SSRS integrate with Power BI similar to SharePoint integrated mode?
That's also coming. They actually publicly announced that one at the Business Analytics Conference in April, that they were going to have reporting services reports, traditional reporting services reports, be deployed to Power BI sites. It hasn't been released yet, but it was supposed to be fairly soon. So not there yet, but it will be. Go ahead. Anything else?
Yep, one more. Is there any way to visualize measures on two axes, percentage and count, as an example?
Oh, okay. So for Q&A to interpret two measures and visualize them into two different axes, it can. Just depends on how you ask the question. So depending on, we're almost out of time, so I'm not going to flip back there, but depending on how you ask the question, so if I want to say, show profit and costs by year, in that case, if you ask a question like that, it should show you two separate line charts or two different axes there to be able to visualize that data. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but depending on how you ask the question, it's possible that it could do that. It could actually have two metrics on two different axes. Now, if you're asking for it to show like a percent and a numeric value both on the same chart as like a bar chart and a line chart together, I don't think there's a smooth way to ask that question yet. And in fact, it's all reliant on Power View, and you can't really do that with Power View yet either. So if you can't do it with Power View, you can't do it in Power BI Q&A. So hey, let me wrap up on this here. I know we're out of time, but as far as licensing, because I do get a lot of questions on licensing, and I do not work for Microsoft. I am by no means a licensing expert, but they have it pretty plain and clear on their website. If you go to PowerBI.com, you can find the licensing here, and you can of course try it. I would recommend trying it. And these are actually the 3 different ways that you can do Power BI. Okay, and here's how it's been explained to me. If you already have SharePoint Online and you already have Office 365, then you are looking at $20 a month right now. And that price is set to go up eventually. But $20 a month to do just Power BI if you already have SharePoint Online and perhaps you don't need Office 365, $20 a month. If you are, maybe you have a user that does not necessarily need, remember I gave the example earlier that they don't necessarily need to have the ability to develop synonyms and to develop things inside of Power Pivot, they just want to go look at things, then they're looking at this middle tier here where they need a license of Power BI for Office 365 and SharePoint Online Plan 2 to be able to do just the interactive functionality here. The last one here is really the whole thing, $52 a month per user to do everything. And that's just kind of everything all up under the sun to do Power BI there. So I'll certainly try my best to help if you have licensing questions. I'll look at questions as Liz sends me the final report that has all the questions in it. But I'll do my best. Microsoft's going to be, of course, the right person to ask for licensing questions when it comes to Power BI and really anything SQL Server or Microsoft related. They're going to have the best answer for you licensing-wise. But Liz, I think we're out of time, right?
Yep.
A few minutes after, actually. So I'll let you close this up.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And we'll be posting this by the end of the day tomorrow.
All right, thanks, everybody. And I do take those questions. If you ask them in the chat window, I will write a follow-up blog on them. Thanks.